Butterfly Hollow, a novel for ages 10 years and older by Maria Cisneros, Toth. Chapter 4. Before school let out, Miss Sweetwater gave us a lecture about how we had to trade valentines with everyone in class. It was her new rule, but that was not going to happen. I'd rather eat a bucket of worms than give Harvey a valentine. After my chores were done, Momma let me go uptown to spend my piggy bank money on paper and crayons to make my cards. I checked both ways and darted across the highway. Hank the barber waved from his big picture window facing Main Street. I skipped toward Bertie Maybell's grocery and met Rosella Beard as she stepped onto the store porch, her arms wrapped around a bag of goods. "Afternoon, Charlene. How's your folks?" "Good, thank you. Tell 'em I say hello." As she edged down the steps, I entered the store. The cowbell above the door jangled, and the smell of licorice pulled me inside. At the back of the grocery, some of the usual townsfolk huddled around the heating stove, jabbering away. "Anybody seen Otis lately?" asked Jiggs Johnston, who slouched on a chicken feed sack near the mops and pails. Bertie climbed onto a stepladder and swiped at the cobwebs with her feather duster. "Otis will turn up sooner or later," she said. "Always does." I jingled my pocket full of pennies. I felt rich, just like Auntie Versa. Bertie twirled her duster, gathering sticky spiderwebs like cotton candy on a paper cone. She shot a glance my way. "Can I help you, darlin'?" "I need a tablet and crayons." I held up my hand and showed her a fistful of coins. "Now there's something I don't see too often. A cash-paying customer." She pointed her duster toward a wire rack of stationery supplies. "Over there, and in case you're interested, a new shipment of candy arrived today." I eyed the shelves beneath the front counter. My mouth watered at the sight of suckers, cinnamon drops, jawbreakers, fat yellow and green gumdrops, chocolate bars, and my favorite, licorice shoelaces. The cowbell jangled again. "Brr! Feels like snow." Sheriff Barnes shook off the cold. "Make room for the sheriff, boys." Bertie hopped off the stepladder. The sheriff joined the others and warmed his hands at the stove. Dirty George sat on top of a wooden barrel. He spat tobacco juice into the small can he kept tucked inside the bib pocket of his patched overalls. Otis must have run out of snuff by now. Tallulah Corbin popped out like a spider from behind a box of golden dust-soaked flakes. Her spectacles hung on the witchetty bump on her nose. She pursed her lips and prattled. "If you ask me, that no-good bootlegger probably took off to Nashville." When she jabbered, her jaw made a loud cracking sound. Otis did have a habit of disappearing whenever Daddy gave him his share of the moonshine profits. He'd take off and no one could find him till he was good and ready to be found. "I'll never forget the day Otis come tumbling into the store during a downpour," said Bertie, as she pecked at the stiff adding machine keys. "He was soaked clear to the skin. I think it was the time he'd gone off to Chicago." Dirty George dug his fingers into a pouch. He tucked a wad of chewing tobacco into his cheek and jawed it around till it settled into a lump beneath his bottom lip. "Otis is one lucky dog. Got to see the World's Fair. I've only seen a picture postcard of it once." "That's what this town needs, a postcard," Jiggs said. "Who'd ever want to buy a picture postcard of our town?" Bertie chuckled. "Friendly isn't even on the map." "Then someone ought to put it on the map," Jiggs shot back. The sheriff slugged over to the red cooler and helped himself to a bottle of Coca-Cola. "Mimosa Bank got robbed this morning," he said. Bertie gasped. "Good Lord, what's this world coming to?" "You know," Jiggs said, "last time I seen Otis, he had a wallet full of dollar bills this high." With his thumb and finger he showed how thick. "Well, you know how he likes to brag. You don't suppose—" "Otis a bank robber?" Dirty George threw in his 2 cents. "A robber needs a getaway car to hold up a bank, and all Otis has got is that broken-down heap at his place." The sheriff guzzled the soda, plunking the empty on the counter. As he meandered back toward the heating stove, he asked, "Anyone remember how long Otis was gone last time?" "Couple weeks." Dirty George scratched his jaw. Car grease and dirt grimed into the cracks of his knuckles. "Maybe a month. Shoot, I forget. But I do recollect the doc giving him an eye examination. Otis had ambrosia. Ain't that so, Doc?" "Yup." Doc Holding's teeth clamped onto the stem of his pipe. The cane rocker cricked as he rocked back and forth. His black leather bag lay at his feet like a faithful dog. "Actually, the correct medical term is amnesia." Jiggs slid off the chicken feed sacks where he'd been roosting and shuffled over to Dirty George. "Stand up, Georgie Porgy." He pointed his finger at the slope of Dirty George's nose, play-acting the way Doc Holding had examined Otis. "Follow my finger." Jiggs's finger moved up and down and all around till Dirty George staggered and lost his balance, like he drunk too much of Daddy's moonshine. He bumped into the heating stove, scorching his backside. Everyone laughed. Even Mrs. Mink, the preacher's wife, let out a giggle at the counter. Doc Holding laughed so hard he started to cough. He reached inside his doctoring bag and pulled out a paper sack and popped a lemon drop into his mouth. With Otis not remembering how he got to St. Louis, he tugged on his ear. Or was it Arkansas? "Oklahoma," said Dirty George. He opened his bib pocket and spat. Doc Holding went on. "Important thing is his amnesia was temporary. Amnesia is usually caused by some sort of shock, like a hard knock to the head." "Amnesia, ha!" Bertie handed Mrs. Mink her change. "Only thing Otis ever forgets is to pay his store credit." The preacher's wife gathered her grocery bags. Sheriff Barnes leaped off his chair, nearly knocking it over. He cut in front of Mrs. Mink. "Here, let me get that door for you, ma'am." "Why, thank you, Sheriff. Hope we'll be seeing more of you in church." She smiled at him. Her boy Harvey dawdled in front of the candy counter. She looked over her shoulder. "Harvey, honey, don't spoil your supper." She brushed past the sheriff. "See you on Sunday, Sheriff?" He returned the smile and nodded. I muttered under my breath, "Harvey stink, don't spoil your supper." Want to know what I think? Harvey turned and faced the crowd at the stove. "Pirates kidnapped Otis. They stole his treasure and buried it where no one will ever find it." The sheriff laughed. "Buried treasure, eh?" "Harvey's stupider than I thought." Or maybe Harvey ripped off a hunk of licorice with his front teeth. Maybe the Gator Man ate him. Sheriff Barnes howled and folded at the waist like a paper doll left out in a soaker. "Boy, you sure got a wild imagination." "Sounds like he's been reading too many funny papers." Doc Holding chuckled and coughed again. I shot Harvey a cross-eyed look. He whipped out a metal pea-shooter, loaded it with ammunition, and took aim. I ducked behind the shelf where Momma bought her personal items. "Nanny, Nanny, you missed me." I stuck my thumbs in my ears and wiggled my fingers at him. "My eye! My eye! I can't see!" Tallulah whooped. Dang, that pickled-breath boy shot that old biddy's eye out with a store full of witnesses. Harvey bumped past the sheriff as he bolted out the door. Bertie hollered after him, "How many times do I have to tell you kids not to play with those dangerous contraptions in my store?" The soles of Harvey's shoes slapped against the cement walk as he hightailed it away from the store. Sheriff Barnes stood at the door, shaking his head. That boy can sure run fast. It was close to supper time, and the crowd at the heating stove began to thin. The sheriff put on his hat and pushed the screen. "Reckon I better have a talk with his folks." "Yup, Harvey Stink is dumber than a cow. That stupid boy left the evidence at the scene of the crime. His pea-shooter lay on the floor for all to see." Doc Holding reached for his black bag and examined Tallulah's eye. In his gentle manner he said, "Oh, I think you'll live." Tallulah crowed, "I want that boy's hide switched." Bertie slipped my new box of crayons and tablet into a paper sack. She smiled as she handed me a cherry sucker. No charge. "Thank you, Bertie." Soon as I skittered down the steps and reached the cement walk, I slipped the wrapper off and stuck the sucker in my mouth. I had promised Momma that I'd be home before dark, and it was getting late. I crossed Main, skipped past the Green Light Diner, and headed toward the railroad tracks. Under my breath, I sang, "Harvey Stinks in trouble, Harvey Stinks in trouble." I hurried past the train depot and cut across the rails, the sound of a harmonica playing, and the sweet smoky smell of a bonfire and boiled coffee drifted from the hobo jungle, nestled in the woods away from the highway. The setting sun shied behind the leafless branches of the dogwoods lining the entrance of Stump Road. I skipped past the summer fields, the sweet cherry sucker melting in my mouth. My tongue would turn red before I got home. Deep in the barren apple orchard, the farmhouse windows were warmly lit. Horses whinnied. Goats cried, "Maa!" I tossed a glance over my shoulder, wishing Daddy's truck would sputter up the road, and he let me ride along on the sideboard. But I knew it was his night to make juke joint deliveries. Then I had an idea. I'd make Daddy a valentine and leave it on the kitchen table for him. Pulling the disappearing sucker out of my mouth, I walked past Otis's ramshackle cabin. I wonder where he took off to this time. It's not fair the way Daddy has to work his tail off while Otis gets to play hooky. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something rustling in the thicket of trees behind his place. The shadowy figure darted from tree to tree. Hair on the back of my neck prickled. I stood still and stared past the old truck with 4 flat tires, the dark cabin, and toward the spooky stretch of woods. The brambles shook again. "It's the Gator Man! Run!" I let out a scream, and the sucker flew from my mouth, hitting the dirt. My grocery bag plunked at my feet. I snatched it and bolted up the road, barreling past Percy's property. Rusty soared off the front porch, barking and nipping at my heels all the way home. Momma burst out the front door, smacking her broom. "Scat! Get on home!" Rusty yelped and scampered back toward Percy's. "Supper's ready," she said, stepping back inside. Catching my breath, I held onto the screen door and looked up the darkening road. The cows in the pasture across from our place mooed softly. I thought I saw a shadow hunch close to the ground across the way. Was it moving? I tensed, gripping the edge of the screen. "Charlene!" Momma called from the kitchen. I jumped and let out another scream. She rushed through the parlor. "What on earth?" With a shaky finger, I pointed. "The Gator Man's out there!" "How many times do I have to tell you there is no Gator Man?" Momma stood on the porch with her hands on her hips and looked all around. "Oh, it's probably just that bothersome dog. Now come and eat your supper before it gets cold." We stepped into the warm house, shutting out the monsters lurking in the shadows of the evening gloom. I dropped the sack with the tablet of paper and crayons onto the coffee table. As Momma headed to the kitchen, I knelt on the couch and peeked out the parlor window. Maybe it's just Otis and he's come to pick another fight with Daddy. Except he knows Daddy does juke joint deliveries on Thursdays. Wait! There it is again. I watched as the dark figure rose and crept up the road. I glanced at the door, hurried over, and turned the lock.